early 1815, Europe believed the long nightmare of war had finally come to an end. For more than a decade, the continent had been dominated by one man. His armies had marched across Europe, defeating kingdom after kingdom and reshaping the political map of an entire continent. That man was Napoleon Bonaparte. But by 1814, even Napoleon's incredible military genius could no longer stop the combined power of Europe's great empires. After years of relentless warfare, the Allied armies of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria pushed into France itself. Paris fell, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate his throne. For the first time in years, Europe finally believed that peace had returned. Napoleon was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. It was a tiny kingdom compared to the vast empire he once ruled, but he was still allowed to govern the island. To the leaders of Europe, it seemed like a safe solution. Napoleon was defeated, or so they thought. In reality, Napoleon never accepted defeat. Even while living in exile, he carefully watched the political situation in France. The restored Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII was unpopular with many soldiers and citizens who had benefited from Napoleon's rule. Discontent slowly spread across the country. Napoleon realized something important. France was not as stable as the Allied powers believed. If he acted quickly, he might still regain his throne. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon made his move. With only around 1,000 loyal soldiers, he escaped from Elba and sailed toward the southern coast of France. It was an incredibly risky decision. If the French army remained loyal to the king, Napoleon would be arrested immediately. But Napoleon understood the psychology of his soldiers better than anyone. As he marched north through the French countryside, royal troops were sent to stop him. One famous moment would become legendary in European history. When Napoleon encountered a regiment sent to arrest him, he walked forward alone toward their guns. According to many accounts, he opened his coat and said something like, "If there is among you a soldier who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." For a moment, the soldiers stood silent. Then something extraordinary happened. Instead of firing, the soldiers shouted, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" They joined Napoleon. Again and again, this scene repeated itself as Napoleon continued marching toward Paris. Entire regiments switched sides. Instead of facing resistance, Napoleon's army grew larger every day. By the time he reached the capital, the king had already fled. Napoleon had returned to power without fighting a single battle. This dramatic return would later be known as the beginning of the famous 100 Days. Across Europe, the news caused immediate panic. The Allied powers could hardly believe what had happened. They had thought Napoleon was gone forever, yet suddenly he was once again ruling France. The reaction was swift and decisive. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia declared Napoleon an outlaw and began preparing their armies for war once again. This time, their goal was clear. Napoleon had to be defeated completely. There could be no second chance. Napoleon understood the danger immediately. The Allied powers were gathering massive armies that would soon invade France from every direction. If he waited too long, he would be overwhelmed. So he decided to act first. Napoleon planned a bold and aggressive campaign. Instead of defending France, he would attack the Allied armies before they could fully unite. His target was Belgium, where two major enemy forces were gathering. One army was led by the British commander, the Duke of Wellington. The other was the powerful Prussian army, commanded by Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. If Napoleon could defeat these two armies separately before they combined their forces, he might still win the war and save his empire. The fate of Europe would once again be decided on the battlefield, and all of it would lead to a small place in Belgium that few people had ever heard of before. A place called Waterloo. By the middle of June 1815, Napoleon's plan was already in motion. His army had moved quickly into Belgium, hoping to strike the Allied forces before they could unite. Speed had always been one of Napoleon's greatest advantages, and once again he intended to use it. His first objective was to separate the two enemy armies. To the west stood the forces of the Duke of Wellington, a calm and disciplined commander who had spent years fighting Napoleon's generals in Spain and Portugal. To the east was the Prussian army under Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher, a determined leader who had sworn never to accept Napoleon's return. If these two armies joined together, Napoleon would be badly outnumbered. But if he could defeat them one by one, the entire campaign might still be saved. On June 16th, Napoleon attacked the Prussians near the village of Ligny. The battle was fierce and chaotic, but by the end of the day, Napoleon had achieved an important victory. The Prussian army was forced to retreat. Napoleon believed that this defeat had pushed them far enough away to prevent them from returning quickly. Now his full attention turned toward Wellington. 2 days later, on June 18th, the two armies met near a small Belgian village called Waterloo. It was not a large town or a famous battlefield at the time, just a quiet rural area surrounded by farms, fields, and narrow roads. But by the end of that day, it would become one of the most famous battlefields in history. The weather had been terrible the night before. Heavy rain soaked the ground and turned the fields into thick mud. This delayed Napoleon's attack because his artillery would be less effective on wet ground. Meanwhile, Wellington carefully positioned his troops along a gentle ridge. It was not a tall hill, but it provided an important defensive advantage. Much of his army was hidden behind the slope, protected from direct artillery fire. Several strong defensive points were placed in front of the line. Farms such as Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte became key positions that would soon see brutal fighting. By late morning, the battle began. Napoleon opened the engagement with a massive artillery bombardment. French cannons fired across the battlefield, hoping to weaken the Allied defenses before the infantry advanced. Soon afterward, waves of French soldiers began moving forward. The fighting around Hougoumont quickly became one of the bloodiest parts of the battle. French troops repeatedly attacked the fortified farm, but British guards and their allies defended it stubbornly. Flames spread through the buildings as the fighting continued, yet the defenders refused to surrender. For hours, the battle raged across the muddy fields. Napoleon then ordered a powerful infantry assault against the center of Wellington's line. Thousands of French soldiers advanced uphill under heavy musket fire. Smoke covered the battlefield as volleys of gunfire echoed across the ridge. Despite the pressure, Wellington's army held its position. Then Napoleon tried a different approach. In one of the most dramatic moments of the battle, he ordered a massive cavalry charge. Thousands of armored French horsemen surged forward across the battlefield, hoping to smash through the Allied defenses. The ground shook as the cavalry advanced. But Wellington's troops were prepared. British and Allied soldiers quickly formed defensive squares, tight formations of infantry with bayonets pointing outward in every direction. These squares were extremely difficult for cavalry to break. Again and again, the French cavalry attacked. And again, they were forced back by disciplined musket fire. The battlefield was filled with chaos. Cannon smoke darkened the sky. Horses and soldiers fell across the muddy fields as the fighting continued hour after hour. By the afternoon, both sides had suffered terrible losses. Yet Wellington still held the ridge. Napoleon knew time was becoming a dangerous enemy. Far to the east, something was happening that could change the entire battle. A new army was approaching. At first, many French officers hoped it might be reinforcements sent by Napoleon's own commanders. But the truth was far more dangerous. The army marching toward Waterloo was not French. It was Prussian, and their arrival would soon transform the battle into a catastrophe for Napoleon. By late afternoon on June 18th, the battle had already lasted for hours. The battlefield around Waterloo was covered with smoke, mud, and exhausted soldiers. Thousands had already fallen, and yet the outcome was still uncertain. Napoleon believed that victory was still possible. Wellington's army had endured constant attacks throughout the day. French artillery had pounded their positions. Infantry assaults had pushed against their lines, and massive cavalry charges had shaken their defenses. To many observers, it seemed impossible that Wellington's army could hold much longer. But Wellington remained calm. He knew that time was on his side. Earlier that day, he had received confirmation that the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher was marching toward Waterloo. If the Prussians arrived in time, Napoleon would suddenly face two armies instead of one. Napoleon understood this danger as well. Reports had reached him that enemy troops were approaching from the east. At first, French commanders hoped these soldiers might be a delayed French corps sent by one of Napoleon's marshals. But as the columns grew closer, the truth became clear. They were Prussians. the first Prussian forces arrived near the village of Plancenoit on Napoleon's right flank. Suddenly, the French army had to fight in two directions at once. Napoleon quickly sent troops to block the Prussian advance. Fierce fighting broke out in the streets of Plancenoit as French and Prussian soldiers battled for control of the village. But the Prussians kept coming. More and more of Blücher's army arrived throughout the afternoon. Their presence placed enormous pressure on Napoleon's right side, while Wellington's army continued resisting in front. The situation was becoming desperate. Napoleon now needed a decisive breakthrough. There was only one force left that might achieve it: the Imperial Guard. For years, the Imperial Guard had been the most elite formation in Napoleon's army. These veteran soldiers had fought in many of the Emperor's greatest victories. They were known for their discipline, their courage, and their loyalty. Across Europe, they had gained a reputation for being nearly unstoppable. Napoleon decided to use them in a final attack against the Allied center. If the Guard could break Wellington's line, the entire battle might still turn in Napoleon's favor. As evening approached, the Imperial Guard began advancing toward the ridge. Tall bearskin hats rose above the smoke as the elite soldiers marched forward in perfect formation. French officers shouted orders while drums beat across the battlefield. Many French soldiers watching believed this was the moment that would save them. The Guard had never failed before, but this time was different. As the Imperial Guard approached the Allied line, hidden British and Allied troops suddenly rose from behind the ridge. They opened fire at close range, unleashing devastating volleys of musket fire. The Guard continued advancing. More shots rang out across the battlefield. The elite soldiers pushed forward through smoke and chaos, but the resistance was stronger than expected. For the first time in years, the Imperial Guard began to lose momentum. Then something extraordinary happened. The Guard started to fall back. When word spread that the Imperial Guard was retreating, panic erupted across the French army. For decades, soldiers had believed that the Guard never retreated. If even they were withdrawing, it meant the battle was lost. French units across the battlefield began to collapse. Soldiers started fleeing the field as Prussian troops pushed harder against Napoleon's flank. Wellington saw the moment. He ordered a general advance. Allied troops surged forward across the battlefield while the Prussians attacked from the east. The French army could no longer hold its positions. The line completely disintegrated. By nightfall, the Battle of Waterloo was over. Napoleon had suffered a final and devastating defeat. Within days, he was forced to abdicate the throne once again. This time, the Allied powers made sure he would never return to power. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of kilometers away from Europe. There, far from the battlefields where he had once commanded vast armies, he would spend the rest of his life in isolation. The man who had once ruled much of Europe had finally been defeated. The Battle of Waterloo did more than end a war. It ended an era, and it marked the final chapter in the extraordinary rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte.